Maybe hotair.com got it right. Maybe they said it best. CBS News welched Vance sword. They did fact-checking when they said they were not going to do fact-checking. They were clear that there would be no fact-checking, and they did it anyway. And Vance certainly was able to do away with this idea that somehow in some weird world, he's just this angry, bitter, weird guy. He was prepared, he was relaxed, and he was not afraid of any question. But Tim Walz, the governor from Minnesota, absolutely exceeded expectations. Except, of course, when he looked into the camera and tried to explain why he misrepresented where he was in China during Tiananmen Square and didn't answer a question about abortion. Oh, sure, J.D. Vance didn't answer the question about whether or not Trump lost the 2020 election, but that's because he can't answer that question. Tony Katz today. It's good to be with you. Ed Morrissey joins me right now from hotair.com. He's the capo di tutti capo over there. Follow him on Twitter X at Ed Morrissey, Morrissey. Let's start with overall feel of the debate. What did you think?
So, a couple of things on overall feeling. It's a great question, Tony, because this was so much different than debates that we've had over the last couple of cycles, right? This was sort of a throwback, if you will. These were two men who were respectful towards each other, at times perhaps even friendly towards each other, trying to actually focus on substance rather than on name-calling or grandiose demagoguing. And we just really haven't seen much of that. We didn't even really see much of that in the vice presidential debates over the last two presidential cycles. So this was sort of refreshing. And I mean, I was getting text messages from people I know saying, why weren't these two at the top of the ticket?
Right.
Not because they wanted them to be president, but because this was the kind of debate that they wanted. And I think there was a focus group, I think it may have been CNN's focus group, that somebody said, I learned more in 15 minutes of this debate than I've learned in the entire cycle. And I think that there's something to be said for that. I think both men should be commended for that type of focus. Now, that's one aspect of it. The other aspect of it was one person showed up ready to do this, and the other person clearly wasn't. And the person who showed up ready and prepared was J.D. Vance, very clearly. And Tim Walz looked like he was out of his element the entire night.
Let me push back on two parts of that there, Ed. First, this idea that we are mistaking quote unquote civility for topic, which is to say there was one question about Israel. There was nothing about the idea of defense posture in the United States, nothing about how many ships in the U.S. Navy, nothing about when we should deploy. There was nothing about whether or not our aircraft carriers in the Mediterranean can act as a deterrent to Tehran, and does this mean a purposeful, proactive, kinetic action against Tehran for their attack on Israel. There was no question about how aid gets to people in North Carolina, nor a conversation about presentational style of dealing with a crisis from weather in the United States. My point is that while they were kind to each other and often agreed with each other, which drove me a bit nuts, we didn't get to the subjects that maybe America actually wanted to get to.
Well, that's a different, I mean, to me, I think that's a different topic. I mean, there's certainly plenty of disagreement between J.D. Vance and Tim Walz. I mean, there was plenty of that type of debate that was going on, but it was a debate. It was an actual debate. And I thought it was handled that in that sense well by both candidates. What you're talking about is the moderation. And the moderation was flat out horrible. And I'll go to the first question. I didn't even mention this in my post. But the first question was asking whether Israel should preemptively strike Iran. Now, just hours before this took place, Iran launched 180 ballistic missiles at Israel, which means that there isn't any preemption involved here. What you're talking about is a retributive strike or a response strike, but it's not preemption. I mean, the whole framing of that question was idiotic, and it didn't get any better from there. The question set was cooked. The subject matter was cooked. You're right. We didn't hear anything about China in terms of its military. We didn't hear anything about Taiwan, which is going to be a flashpoint. We didn't hear anything about U.S. military readiness. We didn't hear about the federal deficit. We didn't hear one thing about the federal deficit from the question set. We did hear, I think J.D. Vance brought it up once or twice, but that was it. And so, I mean, these are major issues. Instead, we heard about childcare, democracy, which I thought J.D. Vance handled brilliantly by turning it into a question about censorship, and you know, things that are way down the issue sets for most American voters. And it was basically the same issue set that ABC News presented in its presidential debate, which was equally, if not non sequitur-ish, I would at least say silly in topic selection, especially for a presidential election where war is very clearly on the horizon on at least two fronts.
Talking to Ed Morrissey of HotAir.com, his latest CBS News Welched Vance Sword. You can get that at HotAir.com. Vance did. There was no question that he was afraid of. Nothing that he would not address, nothing that he would not tackle head on, and nothing that he had to reach for. He clearly had the answer. Talk to me about how you saw Vance's responses, and then we'll get into Tim Walz.
Well, first off, I think that we're looking at substance. I think Vance clearly demonstrated that he's got a grasp of substance, which is pretty good. I mean, this is only his second election, right? He's only been in the Senate, I believe, 2 years, or maybe 4 years, right? 2 years. But he has a good grasp of these issues. He's well-versed. He has clearly researched it. He is able to argue the nuances of it, of all of these different policy sets. I thought his answer on abortion, well, you know, I thought maybe a little excessively gracious, was calculated very well to appeal to a broader set of voters, which is what he's supposed to be doing. So, I mean, I think he came in there with a plan. I think he came in there prepared, and I think he executed his plan brilliantly. And the biggest part of that plan was reminding everybody that Kamala Harris has literally been on the job for 3.5 years and hasn't done anything that she's saying that she's going to do. And he said that over and over and over again. Of course, his closing argument just hammered that point. And Tim Walz never actually responded to that. Never had a response for it. Tone-wise, you could see that Vance was in his element. He was comfortable. He was relaxed. He was friendly. He was charming. He looked into the cameras. When Walz was speaking, he was respectful, although he had a couple of those skeptical face looks that kind of went viral on social media. This was a guy who was really comfortable on that stage, and we can talk to Tim Walz, but I mean that was a huge contrast.
Well, in the visuals, right? Tim Walz was looking to the camera, but he did look very deer in headlights. He did look lost. He looked like the previous governor of Minnesota, Dayton, I believe it was, who always had this look of somehow he had dropped his ice cream cone and was about to cry. I mean, tell me I'm wrong.
I forgot. No, I'd forgotten about Dayton. You're exactly right. That's exactly how Dayton was.
So on the visual, and visuals matter, even for Walz, who I think was more prepared than many people thought he could be. I think he exceeded a lot of expectations last night. The visuals are really bad, and the people denying that they matter are just out of their heads.
You know, do they matter?
Yes.
Yeah, I think they do. Yeah, I mean, I think that you're looking at 90 minutes, and there's multiple levels that people look at these things from. And I think that the optics matter. I think that's one of the things that voters are looking at. Most voters aren't going to get a chance to get within eye shot of either one of these two guys. So this is their one opportunity to present, right? And again, I think that that's one reason why Donald Trump sometimes struggles to look good in debates. He looks great at rallies, but I think he has too much of sometimes he just has too much of a fighter in him and wants to go in for the kill constantly. Kamala Harris benefited from a 3-on-1 in the ABC News debate, so she didn't have to deal with the optics quite as much as Donald Trump did. But in this case, there was a 3-on-1 there, but J.D. Vance handled it brilliantly. and Tim Walz never benefited from it.
The Tim Walz commentary on where he was in China and wasn't at Tiananmen Square and misspoke about Tiananmen Square. It was bad stuff. And let me just share this right here.
But being there, the impact it made, the difference it made in my life, I learned a lot about China. I hear the critiques of this. I would make the case that Donald Trump should have come on one of those trips with us. I guarantee you he wouldn't be praising Xi Jinping about COVID, and I guarantee you he wouldn't start a trade war that he ends up losing. So this is about trying to understand the world. It's about trying to do the best you can for your community, and then it's putting yourself out there and letting your folks understand what it is. My commitment, whether it be through teaching, which I was good at, or whether it was being a good soldier or was being a good member of Congress, those are the things that I think are the values that people care about.
Governor, just to follow up on that, the question was, can you explain the discrepancy?
All I said on this was I got there that summer and misspoke on this, so I will just, that's what I've said. So I was in Hong Kong and China during the democracy protests went in. And from that, I learned a lot of what needed to be in governance.
I have no idea how he learned about governance being in Hong Kong that summer, unless, of course, he wants to govern the way China does. But it can't be denied that this was, it's not just a gaffe, Ed Morrissey. This was just a full-on Rick Perry, I forgot what the third one is, kind of moment, and people are kind of brushing over it. I think somebody has to drill down on it.
This was a moment that could have easily been handled by just simply saying, I got it wrong. I in my mind, I recollected that I was there during that. Obviously, I was there a couple months later. I was asked about it, 30 years later, and in my mind, I must have conflated the two, and I apologize. If he just said that, that would have been fine and would have been over with.
But he doesn't do that.
He goes into this 2-minute word salad, right? No, he goes into a 2-minute word salad that, frankly, Kamala Harris must have been pretty envious of after watching this. And he was going everywhere, desperately trying to avoid the actual question. I'm actually surprised that I think it was Brennan that came back and said, well, all that's great, Governor, but can you please answer the question? I mean, that was, I was not expecting them to follow up on that. I thought that they would let him off the hook with that, but they didn't. And he had to come back and say something about the fact that, I think later he said, well, sometimes I'm kind of a knucklehead. No, sometimes you just flat out lie. And then when you're caught in a lie, you don't want to address the fact that you were caught in a lie. And I think voters get that too. And that was fairly early. I think it was about midway through, and he was already not doing well. And I don't think he ever really recovered from that point. I mean, he was clear that he was sweating bullets through that answer. He was talking rapidly, trying to, throw out this sort of blizzard of words to avoid the question and try to make people forget what the question actually was.
And referring to yourself as a knucklehead is not self-effacing. It's not endearing when it comes to a presidential race. It really isn't. It doesn't connect in that way. Talking to Ed Morrissey of hotair.com, let's break down this with a yes or no. Does this debate affect any part of the next 34 days of this election?
Yeah, it's a good question, and I'm not necessarily sure. Normally, I would say a vice presidential debate has nothing to do with it. I mean, and if you want the classic example, it's the Lloyd Vance and Dan Quayle debate, right? Where Dan Quayle, who's a smart guy, he's not a dumb guy, but that wasn't really his element either. He's more thoughtful, and he's not necessarily extemporaneous. And Lloyd Benson just depanced him on national television. And George H.W. Bush went on to win anyway. I mean, so you look at that and you go, if it was ever going to affect an election, that was the one, and it didn't. This time, however, it might be a little bit different because this is the last debate that we're going to see. I doubt very seriously that Donald Trump is going to agree to a debate with Kamala Harris, maybe even especially after last night. This is a great impression to leave with voters. But also, because the top of the ticket is so polarized with people, and independents are probably so so flummoxed as to which way they should go that this might influence the decision to go with the guy who looked and sounded more reasonable, more confident, more like a leader in the number 2 position. And given the age of Donald Trump, I think there's some significance as to who that number 2 guy is. J.D. Vance went into this having to prove that he was ready for this moment, and he did. And so there's a possibility that it might have some impact on the election.
Before I let you go, Ed Morrissey, hotair.com, Nicole Wallace over at MSNBC and this Amy Deal PhD with basically the same conversation. J.D. Vance talking over the female moderators. We women have all been there, over-talked by an entitled mansplainer. This is going to be the left's argument that they couldn't find that J.D. Vance was mean or mean-spirited or rude or to Tim Walz. So because he wouldn't accept the moderators interfering, he's a mansplainer. This is going to help Kamala Harris with the sexism argument and get her elected?
I think that's a measure of how desperate that people on the left are to spin this into some sort of victory for Tim Walz, or even if they can't spin it into a victory for Tim Walz, a defeat for J.D. Vance. And nobody who's looking at that in real time is going to come up with that as a takeaway. What they're going to come up with as a takeaway was what Chris Cuomo came up with as a takeaway over at News Nation, which was that not only was J.D. Vance actually correct about what happened with the Haitian refugees in Springfield, Ohio, and the fact that they were there only because the Biden-Harris administration created a space for them to be there,
right,
but also that that they were poor sports in cutting off his microphone before J.D. Vance could correct them on their misinformation. And that's exactly what the takeaway is going to be on this. I don't know who they're looking to convince with that argument, Nicole Wallace or anybody else, but it isn't going to fly.
Ed Morrissey, hotair.com. That's where you got to go. Find him on the X, Twitter, Ed Morrissey. And you should check out his book, Going Red, Swing Voters and the Need to Expand the Republican and Conservative Brand Through Peer-to-Peer Engagement. You can find that at Amazon.com, wherever fine books are sold. Ed Morrissey, a pleasure. More is coming up. I'm Tony Katz.